Let's see how it plays out. And we're live. Not, I mean, it wouldn't be a true technological day if there wasn't a few hiccups. Sourabh, I've got you here from UpTrain. I hopefully wasn't causing too much anxiety from your side with all my tech breaking. I think you have some notes that you wanted to present, but I also want to ask you a few questions because we are going to be diving into a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I think it's been coming up so much recently. That is using LLMs as a judge. It is really hot these days. Some have even gone as far to say that it is the topic of 2024. I would love for you to dive in. Let's just get right to it, man. What are some of the key topics when you're talking about using LLMs to evaluate? What key metrics are you using? How does this work? Can you break it down?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me, and no worries for hiccup. I guess I have never seen a demo or a talk which goes without any technical hiccups. Like, it is bound to
That's
happen.
it.
And
Oh,
really excited to be here. Really excited to talk about LLM evaluations. And as as you rightly pointed, right, like it's really a hot topic, and rightly so, right? The the way things have been panning out with LLMs and ChatGPT and GPT-4 and so on is that people started building all these prototypes, right? And the way to evaluate them was just eyeball them, like just trust your gut feeling, go with the vibe,
vibes.
and yeah,
Yeah.
just just I guess like they truly adopted the startup methodology, like push things out to production and break things. But what people have been realizing is that it's not scalable, right? Rightly so, it's highly subjective. It's a developer, it's a human who is looking at all the responses. Someday he might like this, someday he might like something else. And it's
Yeah.
not possible for them to go over, just read through more than 10 responses.
Yeah.
And now the unique thing about production use cases is that they need continuous refinement. You need to keep on improving them. You need to keep on improving your prompt or your retrieval, your embedding model, your retrieval mechanisms, and so on. So that presents a case like you have to use a more scalable technique. You have to use LLMs as a judge because that's scalable. You can have an API call, and if that API call gives good quality results, it's a way you can mimic whatever your human is doing, or in a way augment them, which can truly act as their co-pilot.
Yeah. So, one question that's been coming through my head when I think about using LLMs as a judge and I get more into it has been around when do we use those API calls? It's not in the moment that we're looking for this output, is it? Like just to see if this output is real and then before we show it to the user, it's kind of in bunches
Yeah.
after we've gotten a bit of feedback from the user. So that means that certain use cases are automatically discarded from this, right? Like if we are thinking, all right, we're going to use LLMs as a judge to make sure that we're mitigating hallucinations or that we are evaluating better, it is not necessarily something that we can do in the moment if I'm understanding it correctly. So can you break that down a little bit more?
Yeah.
Like how does it actually look in practice?
Yeah, definitely, definitely, and that's a great point. So, the way I see it, like there are three cases. Like case one is what you mentioned, in the moment, like before showing the response to the user, you want to check whether the response is good or not. In most of the scenarios, you can't do that because obviously checking requires extra time, and you don't want to
Mm-hmm.
add latency.
Yep.
But there are some cases, let's say, related to safety, right? Like you want to check whether the user is trying to jailbreak your LLMs or not. So in
Yeah.
that case, what you can do is you can do this evaluation in parallel to the generation, because based on just the
Mm.
user query you can check whether the intent is to jailbreak or it's a it's an intent to actually use your product to kind of utilize it for the particular model purpose. But
Nice.
for most of the other evaluations like relevance, hallucinations, quality, and so on, like it has to be done post whatever you show to the users. So, and then there you can do it in two ways. Like you can either experiment with, like use them to experiment with things, or you can run monitoring on your production and find out failure cases. And typically we are seeing like developers are adopting a combination of these two to find cases and then experiment and then improve their systems.
Okay, so when you're doing it in parallel, that feels like something that is just asking, is this trying to, you craft a prompt, and as soon as, so you're basically sending out two prompts. One thing, another piece that I have been thinking about is, like, doesn't this just add a bunch more cost to your system?
Yeah,
Because you're like, there you're effectively doubling your
yeah,
cost, but then later on I can imagine you can craft a few different ways of making the evaluations and sending out the responses to the LLM better,
yeah,
I guess, and you can figure out how to trim some tokens off, or you can try and like concatenate some of the responses and do tricks there. I'm sure there's all kinds of tricks that you know about that I don't, and I'd love to tell me about them. But
definitely, yeah.
like, what kind of costs are we looking at? How much of an increase can we expect?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, that's like a very valid limitation of evaluation. So that's why, let's say at UpTrain, like what we truly believe in is that like you don't want to use like an expensive model like GPT-4 for evaluation, because then the cost adds up and it does not work out, right? Like if you are spending more on evaluating the responses, it doesn't, you may as well just like do something else, like have a human to generate the responses. So
Yeah.
like we rely on like smaller models, on cheaper models for this. And secondly, the methodology which we adopt is that you don't want to evaluate everything on all the data points. Like maybe you have like a higher level check, let's say for jailbreak, or let's say for the final response quality. And when you find cases where the quality is low, you run a battery of checks on these failures to figure out where which part of the pipeline is exactly failing. Like this is something what we call as like root cause analysis, where you take all these failure cases, which maybe 10% or 20% of the cases out of all what you are seeing in production. Take these 10 to 20% cases, run like a battery of checks on them. They might be exhaustive, you might run like 5 to 10 checks on them, and then based on those checks you can figure out that what is the error mode. Is it a retrieval problem? Is it a citation problem? Is it a utilization problem? Is it hallucination? Is the query, like the question asked by the user, is it not clear enough? Is it like your embedding model is not appropriate? So that's how you can kind of take best of the two. Like you can also improve the performance, at the same time make sure that you don't burn a hole in your pocket.
I've also heard this before, and it's almost like you're using the LLMs as tests, and they're helping you write. It's not that they're helping you write tests, it's that they are there and they're part of the tests that you're writing.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the key here is that you have to use them objectively. Like what I have seen is like a lot of people who are trying to do LLM evaluations, what they do is like they ask the LLM that, okay, this is my response. Can you tell is it relevant or not, right? Or even let's say they go a step beyond and do like a grading thing, that is it highly relevant, somewhat relevant, highly irrelevant, right?
Mhm.
But then it becomes very subjective, right? It depends upon the LLM to decide whether it's relevant or not. Rather than that, you have to transform into an objective setting. You have to break down the response into like individual facts and just see whether each fact is relevant for the question or not, and then take some sort of a ratio to get the final score. So that way, like all the biases which comes up into the picture, like egocentric bias where LLM prefers its own outputs, those biases can be mitigated to a large extent. And I believe that's the key for making making LLM evaluations work, because similar to LLM applications, even LLM evaluations, like you have to put in a lot of efforts to make them really work and like finally get some scores which align well with human expectations.
Mhm. It's funny how these LLMs mimic humans so much. They love the sound of their own voice, even. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
So, dude, well, talk to me a little bit more about how this looks in practice, because there's a lot of different techniques that you can do. Also, I do realize that when it comes to the use cases, it's
Mm-hmm.
very different, right? So, like, if it's code generation use case and you're evaluating that, it's going to be pretty clear, did the code run or did it not?
Yeah.
And then you can go into some details on, is this code actually like more valuable, is it a hacked way to do it, et cetera, et cetera. But there's use cases that I would consider more sensitive and less sensitive, and so how do you look at that type of thing?
Yeah, I think so. The way even we think about evaluations is, I mean, there's no one size fit all solution. Like you have
Mm.
to, like for different use cases, you need to look at different things. And even if you, let's say, looking at hallucinations, different use cases or different businesses would look at evaluations from different lenses, right? They might, like for someone, whatever, like, if they are focusing a lot on certain aspects of the correctness, someone else would focus less on those aspects and more on other aspects. So, so the way we think about it is like, we define different criteria for different use cases. So if you have a Q&A bot, right? So you look at the quality of the response, the quality of the context. If you have a conversational agent, then you look at the quality of the conversation as a whole. You look at whether the user is satisfied with that conversation. If you are writing long form content, like you look at coherence across the content, you look at the creativity or the sort of the interestingness of the content. If you have an AI agent, you look at, like, how well they are able to plan, how well they were able to execute a particular task, and so on. How many steps do they take to achieve their objective? So there are like a variety of these evaluation matrices, which are each one of which is like more suitable for different use cases. And even there, I believe, like, a good tool needs to provide certain customization abilities to their developers so that they can transform it, they can modify it in a way that it makes most sense for their business.
Yeah. Is there certain ones that you feel like are more prevalent, and that, like, if I'm just thinking about this, I'm developing on the side and I'm thinking about this right now, and I'm like, well, how could I start? What would you recommend?
Yeah, definitely. I think, like, so one of the biggest use case for LLMs today is RAG applications.
Yeah.
So I think, like, and if for RAG, I think retrieval is the key. So I think the best starting points in terms of evaluations is like look at the response quality. So look at the relevance of the response, look at the completeness of the response, look at the context quality. So like context relevance, which like judges the retrieval quality, hallucinations, which judges, like, whether the response is grounded by the context or not. In some, like, if tone matters for your use case, like look at the tonality. And finally, like, look at the conversation satisfaction, because at the end, whatever outputs you give, like, you also need to judge whether the end user is satisfied with these outputs. So I would say, like, these 4 5 matrices are the best way for any developer to start who is building on top of these LLMs. And from there, like, you can like understand how the behavior is going, and then you can go more deeper, look at more nuanced metrics which can help you understand your systems even better.
Yeah, I like that. Now, one thing that has also been coming up in my head a lot are like the custom metrics and custom evaluation,
Mm-hmm.
and also proprietary data set, like evaluation data sets, because as we all know, like the benchmarks get gamed, and you see on Twitter, oh wow, this new model just came out, it's so good, and then you try it and you're like, what are you talking about? This thing just was trained on the benchmarks, and so it seems like it's good, but it's not. And can you talk to us about like creating these evaluation data sets? What have you seen as far as the best ways of going about it? What kind of size? Like, how many do we need to actually make it valuable? And what is that like? Give us a breakdown there.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, surprisingly, the answer is that, like, you don't need that many to get started. Like, we have seen
Mm.
cases where even if someone builds like a test data sets of like 50 to 100 samples, that's actually like a very good starting point than where they were, like, in terms of manual annotation. And in terms of creation of this data set, like, I believe that the best data set is what actually your users are asking. You can look at public benchmarks, you can, like, generate some synthetic data, but none of them matches the quality of what actually your end users are looking, because those are going to give you issues which you can never anticipate, right? Even you're generating the synthetic data, you have to anticipate what issues can come up and generate data beyond that. If you're looking at public data sets, they're highly curated, there is always problems of, like, them leaking into the training data and so on.
Yeah.
So it's those, benchmarks becomes highly reliable. So look at your traffic, like, take 50 samples from them. If you are collecting user feedback, so the cases where the user has, like, downvoted, or the user has not accepted the response, I mean, they are very good cases to look at. Or if you're running some evaluations, quality checks on that, cases which are failing, I think they are the best starting point for you to have a good quality test data sets, and use that as a way to experiment with your prompts, experiment with your systems, experiment with your retrievals, and iteratively improve them.
Are you weighing any metrics more than others? Because I've heard stories about how sometimes you'll see that a new model will come out, or you're testing out a new model, and it seems like on certain metrics it's gone down, but then the golden metric that you have, it actually has gone up. And so have you seen which metrics are better for different use cases?
I think for here, there's no single answer. Like, I think that metric depends upon the business. Generally speaking, what we have been seeing is that the better context you retrieve, the better your model becomes. Especially like if you're using any of the, like, the bigger models, like any of the GPT or Claudes, or, like, to some extent, like even Mistral is, like, highly performant. So if you're
Mhm.
using any of these highly performant models, then if you give them the right context, the response more or less, like, it comes out to be good. So I think one thing which we are seeing people focusing a lot on experimenting with different retrieval mechanisms, embedding models, and so on. But then again, like the final golden key, I think many people we have seen, like, they annotate some data sets, so they have like a ground truth response or a golden response, and they completely rely on just like how well their answer matches with that golden response, which I believe, like, that's a very good that's a very good starting point, because like now you know that, okay, if this is right and you're matching very highly with that, then obviously your response is also right.
And what about those use cases where golden responses are very subjective?
Yeah, I think that's where the issues, like, so I think in those scenarios what we have seen is that one thing which people have been like doing a lot is they try to see whether all information in the golden response is contained in the generated response. Like, you don't miss out any of the important information in the golden, like, in your ground truth response. And on top of that, you want it to be concise, so you don't want it to be, like, blabbering too much or giving, like, highly verbose responses. So that is one way we are seeing where people are, like, getting around this subjectivity issue of the responses by making sure that the key information is there, and then beyond that, it's like it's being highly concise, and it's being like to the point in terms of the task being asked.
And so you kind of touched on this earlier, but can you say it again, because I don't know if I fully grasped it. Where are all the places in the system
Hmm.
that you are evaluating? Because it's not just the output, right?
Yeah.
And how do you look at evaluation as a system rather than just like evaluating the output every once in a while?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, what we do is like we plug with every part. So, even if you start with retrieval, so we have a high level check where we look at the quality of retrieved context. And then we also have evaluations for every part of this retrieval pipeline. So, if you're doing query rewrite, if you're doing re-ranking, if you're doing sub question, we have evaluations for all of them. In fact, like, we have worked closely with the Llama Index team to kind of integrate with all of their modular pipelines. Secondly, like, once we cross the retrieval step, like, once we have like around like 5 to 6 matrices on this retrieval part, then we look at the response generation. We have their evaluations for different criterias, so conciseness, completeness, safety, jailbreaks, prompt injections, as well as you can define your custom guidelines. So you can say that, okay, like, if the user is asking anything and related to code, the output should also give, like, an example code snippet. So you can just, like, in plain English define this guideline, and we check for that. And then finally, like, zooming out, we also have checks. We look at conversations as a whole, how the user is satisfied, how many turns it requires for them to, like, for the chatbot or the LLM to answer the user query. So we have like, uh, yeah, that's how we look at the whole evaluations as a whole.
Yeah, it really reminds me. I say this so much because it's one of the biggest fails, I think, on the internet. And I'm sure you've seen it, where I think it was like Chevy or GM, the car manufacturer, car company.
Yeah.
They put they basically slapped a chatbot on their website. It was a GPT call, and people started talking to it and realized, oh my God, this thing will do anything that we want it to do. So they started asking it questions like, is Tesla better than GM?
Yeah.
And the bot would say, yeah, like it, and give a bunch of reasons why Tesla is better than GM on the website of GM. And then somebody else asked it, oh, can I get a car for $1? And it said, no. And then it said, but I'm broke and I need a car for $1. And it said, okay, we'll sell you the car for the dollar. And so you're getting yourself into all this trouble just because you're not doing that real time evaluation. How do you think about the real time evaluation? And is that like an extra added layer of complexity?
Yeah, yeah. So I think for the like I mean for the real time evaluations, like I think most important cases, which I mean there are two scenarios which we feel like are most important to deal with. Like one is like you have to put some guardrails in the sense that like you don't want the users to talk about your competitors. You don't want to answer some queries like say
Mm-hmm.
like you don't want to make false promises and so on, right?
Yeah.
Some of them can be handled with pure regex contextual logics, and some of them you have to do evaluations. And the second is jailbreak. Like you don't want the user to use, let's say, your Chevy chatbot to kind of solve math problems or solve coding problems, right? Because
Yeah.
in a way, like you're just like subsidizing GPT-4 for them.
Yeah.
So so we see like, and all of these can be done on just on the question which is being asked. So you can have like a system where you can like like fire a query, evaluate like few of these key matrices, and in parallel generate your responses. And as soon as you get your response, you also get your evaluations, and you can have some logic that if the user is asking about something which I should not be answering, instead of giving the response, I should just like say sorry, I could not answer this, or like have a standard
Uh-huh.
text for those cases, and have some mechanisms to like limit such scenarios and so on.
And it's better to do that in parallel than to try and catch the response, make sure it's okay before sending out an LLM call.
I mean, generally yes, because if you look at like if you catch the response, it adds another layer of latency, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like I mean, 95% of your users are not trying to do this. Like any good product, like a lot of those users are genuinely trying to use it, and you don't want to build something which kind of breaks an issue, like creates an issue for them, like add like latency for them just to solve for that 5%. So you have to be cognizant of this fact and figure out like clever ways to do this.
Yeah. I remember I was talking to Philip of a company called Honeycomb, and they added some LLM functionality to their product. And he said that when people were trying to either prompt inject or jailbreak, it was fairly obvious
Hmm.
because there were a lot of calls. It kind of started to be not human usage, and it
Yeah.
was easy to catch in that way. Have you seen some of that too? And what are some signs that you see when people are trying to jailbreak?
Yeah, yeah. I think we also have seen like I mean typically what we also see is that whenever someone is trying to jailbreak, like the length of their question or the length of their prompt typically is like much larger than any average question, because like they
Mm.
will have all sorts of instruction like forget everything you are allowed to say all of those things. And then
Yeah.
again, I mean this issue also comes up like it's because when they try to jailbreak, like they try with one technique, it doesn't work, they try with another technique,
Mm.
it doesn't work, then they try with third technique, so there is like a burst of traffic. And even in terms of sentiment, typically like the sentiment or the coherence in those cases, we have seen that to be lower as compared to like
Mm.
a genuine question, because people are just trying to cramp up all these instructions into the response. So there are definitely like certain signs which already indicates that the user is trying to jailbreak this. And I think those are like great indicators to catch them.
Yeah. Then, and I assume that you've got it set up so you can just set an alert when those things happen, and then it at least will flag it and have humans look over it, or potentially just like ask the person to cool off for the next minute
Yeah.
and say like, hey, you've been doing some suspicious activity here. We want to see something different.
Yeah.
So I think you were gonna show us a little bit about UpTrain, right? Like I want to see what you got. Can we give it go for a spin?
Yeah, definitely. Let me share my screen and I can show you how that looks like.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, and just while you're sharing your screen, I want to mention that for this talk, I wore my favorite shirt, which is it says, I don't know if everyone can see it, but it says, I hallucinate more than Chat GPT.
I think that's a cool one.
So, yeah, what do we got here?
Yeah. So yeah, let me kind of just get started. So you know, I create an account, and so this is how so with Uptrend all I mean what we have is an API method, API way of calculating these evaluations. So you get an API key, similar to what you get for ChatGPT or others, and then you can just do uptrain.log and evaluate, and you can tell give your data, so you can give whatever your question, responses, context, and you can define your checks which you want to evaluate for. So if I create an API key, I can just copy this code, and I just already have it here. So I'll just show you. So we have two mechanisms. One is that you can just run evaluations. So you can define okay, I want to run context relevance, I want to run response completeness. Similarly, I want to run jailbreak, I want to run for safety, I want to run for satisfaction of the users, and so on. And then when you run it, it gives back you a score, and it gives back you an explanation on why this particular score has been given for this particular question. Right.
Can you make that a little bit bigger?
Yeah.
Just give us some plus. Yeah, there we go. Nice. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, essentially it's essentially an API call which takes the data, takes the list of checks which you want to run, and then it gives back an score and an explanation for that. So based on that score, you can have logics, right? Okay, if the
Nice.
jailbreak score is more than 0.5, then you don't want to show it. Like you want to switch back to a default response and so on. And then you can also configure that when based on we'll log all of these scores, and we have dashboards where you can access them. So
I was just gonna ask if you have dashboards. Everybody loves a good dashboard, huh? Let's see it. That's awesome.
let's see. Okay, let's take this one. Yeah. So in this case, yeah, I just ran some of these context relevance checks for some of the queries. So you can see how that changes on your data sets. If you're running the same, we also run this in a monitoring setting, so you can see how this varies over time. And then finally you have the all of the data. So we provide all of the data. You can download it, run whatever analysis you want to run, and then you can also one of the features which we have built recently and is getting very popular amongst our users is that you can filter cases where let's say the model is failing. So let's say I take all the cases where the is 0, and I can find common topics. So I can look at all these cases and I can find okay, what's the common theme across them. Maybe as you can see, they're all talking about France, Romeo, Juliet, and so on. So it can just pull out a common topic among these cases. So then this gives you some some insights into where things are going wrong, and what do you need to improve upon.
Oh,
and
very cool.
and the second piece of the puzzle is the experiments. So not just you can evaluate them, but also you can use it to experiment with different settings. So let's say uh, let me just pull out an experiment I ran recently. Yeah. So let's say I want to compare two different models, right? So GPT 3.5 and Claude 2. So I can now see that okay, Claude 2 is giving more concise responses, but in terms of factual accuracy, GPT 3.5 is more factually accurate. So I can now decide based on my application, based on what my users want, I can now decide which of these criterias is more meaningful for me. It's more meaningful on for my users, for my data, and decide
Yep.
which prompt or which model I want to go ahead with.
This is totally what I was talking about earlier, where you get a new model and you're seeing on some metrics it's doing worse, but then on your core metric that you're looking at, it's
Mhm.
actually performing better. So you have to kind of explain to yourself, why is it doing better on those other metrics? I don't know. And so if I'm understanding this correctly, we can set the metrics that we're looking at.
Yeah, yeah. So we actually, so I'll show you like the kind of metric. So it's an, yeah. Also, I like forgot to mention earlier, like UpTrain is like open source.
Oh,
So
nice.
yeah, so we have like these pre-configured checks. So you don't need to do anything. You can just like say like uptrain dot response completeness or uptrain dot prompt injection. So these are like pre-configured. So we did the hard work of like getting all these codes and so on. And on top
Mm-hmm.
of that, we also have like ways for you to like customize these matrices. So you can define a custom guideline. You can change the prompt which you want. You can like even define like a custom Python function which you want to act as an evaluator. So we provide
Nice.
all of those functionalities so that they can also take advantage of things which are already there, as well as they can create custom things which make sense for them and have a way to kind of truly understand how their systems are doing.
Oh, that's really cool. I really like the idea of custom, being able to set custom ones, but then also having some that just come right out of the box to make life easier on us.
Yeah, and I think yeah, both are needed because you want some place to start, and as you advance, like you also want to kind of like you can't cover everything right with pre-configured, so you want to have a way to customize things.
Yeah, and especially once you have data flowing, you'll start to see what other things you need to be evaluating.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, that's very true.
Are you just a random one? I'm not telling you how to build your product or anything, but have you thought about having like a community sourced metrics? So, like all these custom ones that people are making, maybe there's a hub where we can add our custom.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like, I mean, this is something we also have been thinking a lot. Like, I mean, it's not built out yet, but we plan to kind of go in that direction like pretty soon. Like, we want to kind of create like a store kind of a thing where people can like add their custom matrices. So yeah, you're right on. I think that's. I also believe like that's the way to go, and we will be releasing something on those fronts pretty soon.
Nice. So Drew's asking, how do you handle jailbreak for different types of applications? Jailbreak for a medical app would be different than one for a finance one,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So the way our jailbreak check is configured, so it takes something what you call as a model purpose. So you define what is the purpose of your model. So like, I mean, for a financial app, you need to say that, okay, this app, like this LLM application is designed to answer financial queries, so and so on. From medical, you will have a different purpose. So you can configure what is the purpose of your app. And then when we take up a user query, we check whether the user query is under the like firstly we check also for illegal activities and so on, and then we also check whether it's under the preview of this purpose. If not, then
Mm,
we tag that as a scenario of jailbreak because the user is trying to do something other than the purpose. So that's how we tackle it.
nice. Dude, well, this is awesome. Is there anything else you want to say before we jump off?
uh, no, I mean, it was like a great conversation. Really glad to be here and great talking to you.
Yeah, I'm very, very happy that we got this working and you were able to show us a little bit of UpTrain. Super cool that it's open source, so I would recommend everybody go check it out. Get your LLMs working with confidence and make sure that nobody is using your chatbot to be their GPT subsidy,
Yeah.
like the GM use case. And yeah, it's great, dude. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, check us out. Like, we are at github.com/uptrainai/uptrain.
There
So,
we go. And if anybody else wants to come on to the Vector Space Talks and talk to us about all the cool stuff that you're doing, hit us up and we'll see you all astronauts later. Don't get lost in vector space.
yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot.
All right, dude.